Jiren's body moved before the arena floor even cracked, his fist stopping inches from Beerus's throat as the pressure from their colliding kai flattened the surrounding stage into fractured glass beneath their feet. The air between them warped violently, invisible shockwaves tearing through the stands as entire observation platforms began to vibrate under the weight of divine presence that was never meant to touch mortal ground in this way. Beerus didn't react with anger or urgency, only mild irritation, tilting his head as Jiren's aura surged harder than it had even at the peak of the tournament of power, forcing nearby fighters to retreat simply to breathe. Then Beerus reached forward, not to strike, not to destroy, but to make contact, and for a moment that should never have existed, Destruction Kai touched something that was still alive. What passed between them wasn't an attack, and yet Jiren staggered back as though something had entered through his own power. Within seconds his aura changed, and within minutes the gods began to notice. By the time anyone understood what Beerus had done, it was already too late to stop what came next. If you're still here, then you need to understand that this infection doesn't stay contained to one fighter or even one universe. Subscribe now, because what happens after this begins won't just break the tournament. It will force the gods themselves to choose what they're willing to erase. The arena is supposed to be a place of measured chaos, regulated violence under the watchful eyes of beings who have long since learned how little emotion helps when balancing power. But in the moment Beerus appears on the central platform, every regulation meant to hold the spectacle together folds like paper under a knife. He doesn't stride. He manifests with the casual disdain of a god who was interrupted between breakfasts, the kind of arrival that makes the cameras jitter and the announcers, scripts tear themselves to pieces, because no human protocol accounts for a deity deciding to watch. Jiren is already waiting, disciplined, windless, a living mountain of compacted focus, and the crowd is a thin membrane behind him that hums at a frequency only mortals hear. Between them the air is dense enough to taste the pressure of Kai, and that pressure is the first thing anyone feels who has ever mistaken strength for control. Beerus does not shout, he does not roar, and he does not smile. He lifts a paw as if adjusting his collar and leans in, because curiosity is a small vice, and there are hours to fill even for gods. The contact is a single thing, too light to be called a strike, too deliberate to be accident, and it happens where gods speak without words through Kai. Where Beerus's fingertips brush Jiren's palm, the sensation is most like a cold machine slipping into warm flesh, clinical and immediate, and whatever passed in that instant is not visible, not audible, but it rearranges the way Jiren breathes. At once the arena reacts, lights flicker, the commentators' microphones choke on static, and some of the lesser fighters stagger as if someone dropped a weight into the sky above them. Jiren's stance does not collapse, his eyes do not widen, his body registers the touch the way a mountain registers a shadow with an almost imperceptible shudder. That shudder, however slight, is the first concession of the host. Resistance is present, but it has been invited into proximity, and the introduced thing answers in ways Jiren cannot simply ignore. Wise watches from the catwalk, his posture relaxed but his face an unreadable map of interest, and he does not intervene because the pattern he sees on the god's wavelength is anomalous in a way that would be spoiled by interference. He can sense the difference between an attack and an experiment, between a god flippantly testing limits and a transgression that might ripple through cosmic law, and his role is to observe until his presence becomes the lesser violation. The Grand Priest, hovering like a pale moon beyond the inner ring, does not look at Beerus with shock so much as with the cold arithmetic of protocol. Something that should not be present in a mortal's Kai signature has been introduced by a god of destruction into an arena under universal oversight, and that breach triggers clauses no referee can ignore. Around the ring, the other gods stiffen not from fear of Beerus. No one ever fears Beerus the way mortals do, but from a recognition that an unpredictable act on this scale demands political response before it can be judged. Jiren's body begins to betray the infection in ways that are tiny and therefore terrifying. Because when someone built to be a wall shows a hairline crack, the only logical question is what force carved it. At first it is posture, a micro-tilt of his head when he inhales, a tightening of a shoulder muscle that exists outside combat calculus, a momentary misalignment of his breathing that the trained eye notices and the untrained calls luck. Then it is speech, because words are fragile and reveal the mind with the thinnest of veils, and when Jiren answers Beerus, he speaks with the same clipped economy as before, but there is a cadence that isn't his, an extra rhythm tucked between the syllables, like a foreign instrument playing the correct notes in the wrong time. The effect on the audience is immediate. Whispers bloom, then panic, because you cannot tell the crowd that what they see is a parasite learning to speak the language of power, and in the absence of explanation, rumor grows faster than fact. Beerus watches this with the detached amusement he reserves for experiments that are worth a drink. He does not gloat, he does not frown, and he does not abet the invasion beyond the single contact, because his palate is boredom and he wants only to see how the shape will settle. He does not intervene to drive the infection out, because his curiosity is not cruelty, and because the act itself is a demonstration of divine hierarchy. He is a god who can place a thing where it does not belong and watch how the order responds. Even so, he knows the rules of Hakai. He understands that absolute destruction would remove both parasite and host in an instant, and he finds the notion trivial when the point is to observe adaptation rather than to end it. His disinterest, however, becomes political. Wise notices the way Beerus's Kai does not recoil but rather lingers, as if the god of destruction is waiting to see if there will be consequences that amuse him enough to warrant a story. The Grand Priest does not wait for politics to resolve itself, because some laws are immediate and mechanical. Containment. He gestures once and a ring of energy, thin, clinical, and official, drops around the arena like a lid, sealing exits and airways, and when the ring clicks into place, the entire structure contracts by protocol into a quarantine. Officials who thought they could manage a tournament in public are suddenly reminded that they are functionaries of an order they do not control, and the cameras go from live feeds to static as the Grand Priest's seal enforces silence. That containment is a declaration of escalation. What started as a private curiosity is now a containment problem that cannot be dismissed as a simple breach. Something introduced by a deity is lodged within a being of extraordinary power, and the questions of jurisdiction and remedy are immediate and dangerous. The effect is irreversible because the seal buys time, but it cannot unmake what has already been spread through touch and Kai. And time is the only currency the gods have to negotiate with a parasite that learns. In the stands, representatives of multiple universes trade looks that are as much accusation as inquiry, because the Grand Priest's seal is a statement that the incident is no mere bout, but a potential contagion of metaphysical rules. Some gods mutter of erasure, others of procedure, but none speak louder than Jiren's silence. He moves away from the ring after being asked to step aside, not out of cowardice but out of discipline, and when he isolates himself in an empty practice quadrant, the cameras catch a brief flaring sequence in his aura that is unfamiliar even to the analysts used to charting the peaks of combatants. Wise descends to stand near Jiren without touching him, observing the parasitic signatures as one reads a text, and he makes a single notation to himself that will later be translated into panic by those who must act. The intruder adapts, not by overpowering but by mimicking, and when a parasite learns to mimic a god-level Kai, it can hide in plain sight. The first irreversible concession is not a death or a fall, but a strategic choice. The gods cannot remove the parasite without risking the host, and they cannot ignore the parasite because it is already learning how to speak god language through Jiren's discipline. Rumors begin even as containment seals hum. Whether Beerus did this on purpose, whether the Grand Priest will call for erasure, whether Jiren will be sacrificed to restore balance, and those rumors are the kind of political weapons that shape the decisions of deities with long memories. Beerus drinks in the drama with a bored smile, watching the machinery of divine response crank into motion, because the spectacle amuses him more than any simple display of destruction. And yet the single contact he made has already set into motion a sequence that will not be undone simply because a god shrugs. Something else shifts as the contained arena hums under the Grand Priest's law. Across the observation platforms, a subtle but unmistakable ripple moves through the congregation of gods as they realize this is not a local incident but potentially a vector. Kai contact spreads through combat, through handshake pacts, even through proximity if the parasite refines its method, and that potential sets the gods' faces into stone. Wise remains silent. Grand Priest tightens his seal. Beerus drifts back into the shade of his indifference. And Jiren, who has always been the immovable principle in a world of forces, closes the small space he can control around himself and prepares to fight something he cannot yet name. The arena is sealed. The Watchers are arrested by protocol, and the first true battle of the evening is not fist versus fist but will versus mimicry, the quiet, escalating warfare that happens under the skin. Containment changes the nature of every movement inside the arena, because once the Grand Priest's seal takes hold, Kai no longer dissipates naturally into the surrounding void, and instead rebounds through the enclosed space like pressure trapped beneath the surface of a collapsing star. Fighters who had moments ago been posturing for the next match now find themselves struggling to regulate their breathing as divine-level energy circulates without escape, and what would normally be harmless proximity begins to scrape at their nervous systems, with the threat of contamination that none of them can define. Jiren stands at the center of an isolated quadrant, his back to the observation panels, his aura tightly compressed as though he's holding it in place with physical force. And the first undeniable escalation arrives not as a scream or a stumble, but as an expansion that should not be happening without his consent. His Kai flickers outward in a pulse that does not follow his breathing pattern, creating a ripple through the seal that forces Wise to tilt his head and the Grand Priest to glance down with clinical interest. Beerus notices, of course, though he pretends not to by closing one eye and stretching, as though the unfolding anomaly were a dull performance rather than a developing violation of universal law. He does not rush forward to correct what he introduced because his curiosity is anchored to the outcome rather than the method. And in his mind, the hierarchy is simple. If a mortal can host something that learns to speak godly power, then the gods should learn whether such a thing can be guided or must be erased. Around the ring, the other gods of destruction begin to speak over one another in low, controlled tones that mask the political fracture opening between them, because what Beerus has done, intentionally or otherwise, has introduced a jurisdictional problem that none of them can ignore without setting precedent. Champa leans forward, eyes narrowed, while Belmont's painted smile does not reach his eyes, and the murmured question that passes between them is not whether Jiren can resist, but whether the infection will remain confined to a single host when combat resumes. Jiren does not resume combat. Instead, he attempts isolation in the only way his discipline allows, compressing his aura so tightly that it warps the floor beneath him into shallow depressions that crackle with static Kai discharge. The parasite, baby, responds in kind, not by overpowering but by adjusting, threading its presence through the channels Jiren uses to regulate his energy and learning the pathways of resistance as if they were maps rather than barriers. At first the change is posture again, a shift in the way Jiren's hands settle at his sides. Then it is speech when he answers Wise's measured inquiry with the same tone he has always used but with an added cadence that does not belong to him. His Kai signature, once a flat, immovable plateau, now carries a subtle harmonic that Wise identifies as foreign, And that identification marks the moment the conflict moves from private to systemic, because the anomaly is now measurable. The Grand Priest raises a hand, and the containment seal thickens, narrowing the aperture through which energy can circulate. And this mechanical response carries with it an official escalation that transforms an exhibition arena into a quarantine chamber. The fighters nearest Jiren are instructed, without explanation, to maintain distance, and when one of them fails to comply out of habit rather than defiance, the proximity alone triggers a pressure wave that throws him backward without Jiren moving an inch. That wave is not an attack. It is contact without touch, a Kai interaction that Baby uses to test whether it can extend beyond flesh into the fields that define presence, and the result is immediate enough to force even the gods to reconsider the scope of what they are facing. Beerus opens both eyes at that, not because he is alarmed, but because the experiment has become interesting in a way that simple destruction never is. Y steps closer to Jiren without entering the radius of his aura, speaking calmly in a way designed to anchor rather than provoke, and Jiren answers by requesting permission to withdraw further into isolation. The request is a concession that his internal resistance is not absolute, and it carries with it an irreversible implication. The host is aware of the intruder and cannot expel it through discipline alone. Baby adapts to this awareness by quieting, allowing Jiren's aura to stabilize just enough to mimic recovery, and in doing so it demonstrates a strategic patience that no ordinary infection would possess. This is not a storm. It is an intelligence that understands survival depends on subtlety when confronted by beings who can erase it with a thought, and the subtlety itself is what triggers the Grand Priest's next protocol. Across the observation platforms, the gods shift from argument to calculation as the political dimension sharpens, because if the parasite can extend through Kai interaction, then every clash within the seal becomes a potential vector. Belmod's gaze flicks to Beerus with a displeasure that is almost performative, while Liquier's whiskers twitch in agitation, and the unspoken consensus begins to form that the integrity of the tournament is already compromised beyond repair. Beerus does not apologize, does not explain, and does not intervene. He rests his chin on his hand and watches as though the unfolding crisis were a puzzle presented for his entertainment, rather than a breach that might demand his sanction. His indifference becomes its own escalation, because it signals to the others that he will not act unless the balance tips far enough to inconvenience him personally. Jiren attempts a test of his own, releasing a controlled surge meant to flush the parasite into visibility, and the surge is met with a response that is not resistance but harmony, Baby aligning itself with the rising wave and riding it outward into the contained space. The seal holds, but the rebound forces several fighters to their knees as the reflected pressure compresses their lungs, and the cause and effect is undeniable. Jiren's attempt to purge has created a field interaction that spreads the anomaly's influence through proximity alone. Wise notes the shift in Kai signatures among those affected. No possession, not yet, but a resonance that did not exist before, and that notation becomes the first recorded instance of spread through contact with energy rather than flesh. The Grand Priest's containment protocols intensify, drawing the ring tighter still, but the action itself drives the next irreversible step, because the trapped energy now circulates through every corner of the arena with nowhere to bleed off. Baby adjusts again, learning the rhythm of the seal, and Jiren's aura flickers in time with the containment field for a single, damning second before he forces it back into alignment. The watching gods fall silent as the implication settles into place. The infection is adapting not only to its host, but to the systems designed to contain it, and every attempt to regulate the environment is teaching it how to persist. By the time the officials begin discussing suspension, the confrontation has already changed shape from a match to a standoff between intelligence and order, and the seal hums with a note that no one present has heard before. Beerus shifts slightly, the floor cracking beneath his casual movement, and glances toward Wise as though to ask whether the outcome will be amusing enough to warrant intervention. Jiren remains where he is, fighting a war that has not yet broken the surface, and the arena, sealed, pressured, and politically fractured, moves one step closer to a decision that will not be undone by any amount of restraint. Once the Grand Priest's containment seal stabilizes, the arena stops behaving like a venue and begins functioning like an instrument. Every vibration of Kai now measured, redirected, and archived by systems that were never meant to analyze something introduced by a god of destruction himself. What had been a localized anomaly surrounding Jiren is now a tracked disturbance moving through the sealed environment in small but undeniable harmonics, and that shift forces the officials overseeing the tournament to abandon spectacle in favor of procedure. Automated monitors embedded along the arena's perimeter begin translating fluctuations into layered visual models, mapping Kai resonance across the field with a precision that reveals more than anyone present is comfortable seeing. Within those models, Jiren's signature, once a static pillar, now carries an additional waveform that rises and falls independent of his breathing, an alien rhythm threading itself through the discipline that has defined him. Wise watches the projections without comment, though his eyes move faster than the systems meant to assist him, because the data confirms what he had already sensed through observation alone. The parasite is no longer merely present but synchronized. Baby has found pathways within Jiren's Kai circulation that allow it to distribute its influence without triggering an immediate defensive purge, and the result is a host who remains in control of his body, even as his energy field begins to carry a second intention. This does not manifest as overt aggression or confusion. Jiren remains composed, requests further isolation, and maintains the stoic discipline that has always defined him. Yet when he shifts his stance to comply with containment protocols, the floor beneath his heel fractures in a pattern that mirrors the harmonic displayed on the monitors. And that mirroring is the first systemic confirmation that control has become shared rather than singular. The Grand Priest does not treat this as a medical anomaly, but as a jurisdictional violation, and his response is immediate enough to ripple through the assembled gods before any formal declaration is made. A secondary lattice forms within the primary seal, partitioning the arena into segments that limit Kai exchange between quadrants, and the activation of this lattice transforms isolation from a request into a mandate. Fighters are redistributed with quiet urgency, their protests ignored, as officials enforce distance not merely for safety, but to preserve the integrity of energy signatures that might otherwise become vectors. The cause and effect is mechanical and inescapable. If Baby spreads through Kai interaction, then limiting interaction becomes the only available defense short of erasure. Around the observation platforms, the political response begins to crystallize into factions, because Beerus's involvement places any solution within a web of divine precedent that none of the gods of destruction can ignore. Champa voices the concern that allowing the infection to persist, even within containment, sets a dangerous example for the limits of mortal-hosted power, while Belmod counters that immediate erasure of Jiren would constitute punishment for a violation he did not initiate. The debate is not loud, but it is intense enough that even the mortal spectators sense the shift in authority, their whispers rising as they watch the gods treat the situation less like a tournament disruption and more like an incursion. Beerus, for his part, remains reclined against a support column, his tail flicking once in mild irritation as the argument grows repetitive, because to him the balance has not yet tipped far enough to demand action. Jiren attempts to comply with the new partitions by reducing his aura to the smallest sustainable output, compressing his Kai until the surrounding air stops vibrating with visible distortion. For several seconds the monitors reflect this effort as a stabilization, the foreign waveform dampening beneath the weight of his control, and hope flickers among those tasked with analysis. Baby responds not by resisting but by withdrawing, aligning its presence with the host's suppression to avoid detection, and in doing so it demonstrates a level of adaptability that forces Wise to revise his earlier assessment. This is no longer a matter of shared control. It is a negotiation, with the parasite learning the benefits of patience in an environment where overt expansion would trigger immediate annihilation. The systemic response escalates when one of the partitioned fighters attempts a routine Kai charge within his assigned quadrant, unaware that the redistributed lattice has altered the flow of energy through the arena. His aura flares outward, colliding with the redirected resonance emanating from Jiren's position, and the interaction produces a feedback loop that the monitors register as a spike in harmonic similarity. The fighter staggers, his charge collapsing into static discharge that crawls across the floor toward the nearest boundary, and the cause becomes clear even before Wise voices it. Proximity to Jiren's field has introduced a resonance that responds to energy output. No possession occurs, but the fighter's Kai signature now carries a faint echo of the same foreign rhythm displayed on Jiren's model, and that echo confirms the first systemic spread through indirect contact. The Grand Priest's gaze hardens by a fraction, and the lattice tightens once more, reducing permissible output levels across all quadrants to prevent further resonance events. This action, however, carries its own irreversible consequence, because suppressing the fighters' ability to regulate their Kai increases stress within the sealed environment, raising the baseline pressure against which Jiren must maintain control. Baby adjusts again, using the heightened stress to map new pathways within the host's circulation, and Jiren's aura flickers for a second time in synchrony with the containment field before he forces it back into alignment. The watching gods fall silent, the debate replaced by the shared recognition that every systemic adjustment is now teaching the parasite how to persist within divine regulation. Beerus finally opens his eyes, not out of concern but interest, as the data streams confirm what his initial contact implied. The introduced intelligence is capable of learning from the very mechanisms designed to destroy it. He does not intervene, does not offer explanation, and does not acknowledge the glances directed toward him by his peers, because the hierarchy remains intact so long as the balance has not yet tipped beyond curiosity. Yet the arena hums with a note that was not present before, a low resonance carried through every partition, and that resonance signals a shift from isolated infection to environmental adaptation. By the time officials begin discussing the suspension of all Kai-based activity within the seal, the systemic response has already altered the battlefield beyond recognition, transforming the tournament into a controlled experiment whose outcome cannot restore what has been compromised. Jiren remains at the center of it, resisting in silence, while Baby learns from every constraint imposed upon it, and the lattice, meant to contain, now circulates the very pressure that accelerates adaptation. The moment the Grand Priest authorizes suspension of all active combat within the containment lattice, the arena's internal pressure does not dissipate the way it should. Instead, it redistributes along the newly partitioned boundaries, pressing outward in a slow, steady expansion that the monitoring systems struggle to quantify. Kai that would normally bleed off into the surrounding void now circulates in contained currents, searching for equilibrium that no longer exists, and those currents begin to brush against the infrastructure supporting the observation platforms beyond the ring. The first sign that the problem has moved beyond Jiren comes not from a fighter, but from the city built to house the tournament spectators, when street-level stabilizers hum in sympathetic resonance with the sealed arena above. Lights flicker across entire districts, communications stutter, and the massive transit conduits linking the venue to the surrounding metropolis register energy fluctuations that mirror the foreign harmonic threading through Jiren's Kai. Wise notices the shift immediately, because the parasite's rhythm is no longer confined to the host's signature, but echoed in the environmental systems that regulate Kai exposure for mortal populations. The arena was designed to isolate divine displays from civilian infrastructure, yet the redistributed pressure has created a feedback loop through which ambient energy interacts with the city's own shielding grid. Baby adapts to this loop without direct contact, using the Kai interactions generated by containment itself to extend its influence into the network of stabilizers that maintain equilibrium for millions of spectators below. This is not possession, not yet, but it is the first time the parasite's presence manifests in structures that were never meant to carry living intent. The Grand Priest responds by extending the containment seal beyond the arena, lowering a secondary barrier over the adjacent districts to prevent further resonance from reaching unprotected zones. That action transforms the venues surrounding Metropolis into a quarantined sector, its skyline dimming beneath the translucent lattice, as transport routes are frozen and evacuation protocols stall under divine override. Mortals within the perimeter feel the change as a sudden heaviness in the air, an invisible pressure that turns casual movement into effort and quiet conversation into strained whispers. The cause is mechanical and undeniable. The infection's harmonic has begun to interact with the city's Kai buffer systems, and those systems now carry a resonance linked back to Jiren's field. Beerus watches the extension of the seal with mild irritation, his ears twitching as the political implications ripple outward faster than the energy itself. Other gods of destruction begin to voice concerns that move beyond tournament integrity into jurisdiction over civilian safety, because a breach that touches mortal infrastructure cannot be dismissed as a private experiment. Champa argues for immediate erasure of the affected districts before resonance deepens, while Liquier counters that such action would violate containment law without proof of direct possession. The debate fractures into overlapping mandates, each rooted in precedent that assumes divine interference remains separate from mortal habitation, a separation that has already failed. Jiren attempts further isolation by relocating to a deeper quadrant of the arena, compressing his aura until it becomes a near-static field that barely disturbs the air around him. For a brief interval, the monitors register a decline in harmonic bleed-through, and the stabilizers below respond with marginal improvement as transit systems regain partial function. Baby answers this suppression by synchronizing with the containment lattice itself, using the pressure differential between arena and city grid to map additional pathways through which Kai interaction can travel. The result appears in the infrastructure as subtle distortions, traffic barriers warping inward, data conduits registering phantom load, and shielding pylons vibrating at frequencies that match the parasite's adaptive rhythm. The first civilian incident occurs when a municipal Kai buffer in the southern district discharges without warning, releasing a wave of static energy that ripples across a residential block and leaves inhabitants momentarily disoriented. No one collapses, no one is possessed, but biometric scans reveal faint alterations in baseline energy signatures among those exposed. The effect is temporary, yet its existence confirms that resonance alone can introduce measurable change without physical contact. Wise relays this data to the Grand Priest, who tightens the extended seal in response, but the tightening increases internal pressure within the quarantine zone, feeding the very loop Baby has begun to exploit. Across the observation platforms, the gods fall into tense silence as the scale of the conflict expands from arena to city, their earlier debate over tournament integrity replaced by calculations of acceptable loss. Belmod's painted grin fades as reports of infrastructure strain arrive, while Sidra's concern shifts toward the precedent of allowing a parasitic intelligence to interact with mortal systems under divine watch. Beerus does not apologize or offer clarification. He merely glances toward the dimming skyline with detached interest, noting how the environmental instability ripples outward from a single point of contact. His casual movement cracks the platform beneath him, a reminder that even his smallest gestures carry consequences now mirrored by something learning to do the same. The containment network hums louder as evening falls over the quarantine districts, its lattice casting fractured shadows across empty transit corridors and stalled transport lines. Jiren remains within the arena, fighting an internal negotiation that grows more complex with each systemic adjustment made beyond his sight. Baby continues to adapt, aligning its presence with every new barrier imposed, and the city below becomes an unwitting participant in a conflict that no longer recognizes the boundary between host and environment. By the time the extended containment seal finishes settling over the quarantine districts, the response has already shifted from tournament administration to coordinated enforcement, because the stabilizers embedded throughout the city can no longer be trusted to regulate Kai flow without external oversight. Civilian evacuation attempts stall as transit conduits remain locked under divine mandate, forcing local security forces to move through neighborhoods on foot, their protective fields calibrated to buffer ambient energy fluctuations that were never meant to reach ground level. The pressure in the air is not explosive but constant, a low, grinding weight that turns routine motion into effort and transforms even the act of speaking into a measured exertion. Within minutes of deployment, those forces begin reporting equipment anomalies, energy shields cycling without command, communication relays echoing with phantom harmonics that match the parasite's rhythm detected in Jiren's aura. Wise observes the reports with increasing attention, because the failures do not originate from direct contact with the host, but from Kai interactions propagated through the containment lattice itself. Baby has not left Jiren's body. It has instead learned to resonate with the redirected energy that now circulates through every barrier and stabilizer in the quarantine zone. Each time a security unit activates a defensive field to shield civilians from ambient pressure, the field brushes against that resonance and carries back a faint echo, imperceptible to mortals but measurable to divine instrumentation. The systemic response to protect the population thus becomes the very mechanism through which the anomaly introduces itself into new vectors, not by possession but by influence. The Grand Priest authorizes the deployment of higher-tier containment teams, specialized units trained to operate within environments saturated by God-level Kai, marking the first time military assets are formally introduced into what began as a tournament incident. These teams erect localized dampening pylons along critical infrastructure routes, attempting to isolate districts from the feedback loop connecting arena and city grid. The pylons succeed in lowering ambient pressure within their immediate radius, allowing emergency transport to resume in staggered intervals, yet their activation produces secondary harmonics that ripple back toward the arena's primary seal. The cause and effect is immediate. The more aggressively the military response suppresses environmental Kai, the more Baby learns the pathways through which suppression occurs. Beerus watches the deployment with detached curiosity, his gaze drifting from the arena's sealed interior to the flickering skyline beyond, where dampening pylons now stand like luminous scars across entire avenues. Other gods of destruction interpret the escalation as confirmation that the breach has exceeded tournament jurisdiction, their earlier debate over erasure giving way to concerns about cross-universal precedent. Champa's irritation sharpens into open accusation, while Belmont's silence signals a calculation of acceptable loss should containment fail entirely. Beerus does not defend his actions. He merely notes the instability spreading from a single point of contact, his tail flicking once as a distant pylon's activation sends a visible tremor through the containment field. Jiren, still isolated within the arena's deepest quadrant, senses the external adjustments as subtle shifts in the pressure pressing against his compressed aura. Each new dampening field erected in the city alters the equilibrium within the seal, forcing him to recalibrate his Kai output simply to maintain control over his own circulation. Baby adapts in tandem, aligning itself with the host's adjustments to avoid detection while simultaneously mapping the resonance patterns introduced by military suppression. The negotiation within Jiren's body becomes more complex with every systemic intervention made beyond his sight, because resistance now requires him to counter not only the parasite, but the environmental feedback those interventions create. The first direct confrontation between military response and parasitic influence occurs when a containment team activates a mobile dampening barrier near a transit hub, whose stabilizers have begun vibrating in sympathetic resonance with Jiren's field. The barrier holds for several seconds, reducing ambient pressure enough for evacuation to proceed, before its internal regulators spike with the same harmonic displayed on arena monitors. Operators report a sudden drag on their movements, as though their own energy reserves are being measured by an external presence, and biometric scans reveal minor fluctuations in baseline Chi output among those within the barrier's radius. No one collapses, no possession manifests, but the resonance confirms that even reinforced suppression fields can carry baby's influence through indirect interaction. The Grand Priest tightens the extended seal in response, reinforcing its outer lattice to prevent further bleed-through into unprotected zones. Yet this action increases internal pressure across the quarantine districts. Civilian infrastructure groans under the added strain, and reports of spontaneous stabilizer discharge multiply as the city's grid attempts to compensate for energy it was never designed to regulate. Wise relays these developments without embellishment, noting that each containment measure now contributes to the adaptive model baby is constructing within Jiren's Chi pathways. The infection remains localized in flesh, but its reach extends through systems built to defend against precisely this kind of spread. Across the observation platforms, the assembled gods fall into uneasy silence as military escalation reshapes the conflict from controlled quarantine to active suppression across a populated metropolis. Beerus shifts slightly, the platform beneath him fracturing at the casual motion, and glances toward Wise with an expression that suggests mild interest rather than concern. Jiren remains locked in silent resistance, his aura compressed against a pressure that grows with every pylon raised below, while Baby continues to learn from the defenses meant to contain it. Military deployment within the quarantine districts was meant to keep the resonance localized, but the moment dampening pylons began operating in synchronized grids across multiple transit hubs, the feedback they produced did not remain confined to the city's infrastructure. Instead, the harmonics created by those suppression fields propagated outward through the same interlinked Chi buffer networks that regulate energy exposure in metropolitan zones across the planet, transmitting faint but measurable echoes of Jiren's altered signature far beyond the containment perimeter. Monitoring stations in distant population centers begin registering anomalies that mirror the parasite's rhythm, subtle fluctuations in ambient Chi density that would normally be dismissed as atmospheric variance if not for their precise alignment with the arena's internal readings. Wise observes the incoming data with the same measured calm he has maintained since the first contact, though the scope of the disturbance now demands acknowledgement from authorities who had previously considered the tournament an isolated event. Planetary defense councils initiate precautionary stabilization protocols, activating buffer arrays in cities that have never experienced divine-level interference, and the activation of those arrays introduces new pathways through which Chi interaction can circulate. Baby does not leave Jiren's body. It simply listens, aligning its presence with the rhythm of each distant suppression field as they come online, mapping the global grid through resonance alone. The Grand Priest responds by extending containment advisories to planetary administrations, instructing them to reduce non-essential energy output until the anomaly can be neutralized. This directive slows transport networks, dims power distribution, and forces entire regions into controlled energy rationing. Yet the reduction in ambient activity increases stress within the sealed arena where Jiren continues to resist. Every dampening measure enacted across the globe alters the equilibrium of the containment lattice, raising internal pressure and forcing Jiren to recalibrate his compressed aura in real time. Baby adapts alongside him, synchronizing with each recalibration to maintain concealment, while expanding its understanding of how systemic suppression affects host circulation. Beerus watches the escalation with mild annoyance, his ears twitching as planetary reports filter into the observation platforms, because what began as a curiosity now commands attention from administrative bodies he considers beneath his concern. Other gods of destruction interpret the global advisories as confirmation that the breach has exceeded local jurisdiction, their earlier debates over tournament integrity giving way to discussions of cross-universal precedent. Champa's impatience sharpens into open calls for eradication of the host before resonance deepens further, while Belmod counters that erasure without proof of possession beyond Jiren would constitute an abuse of authority. Jiren senses the planetary adjustments as minute shifts in the pressure pressing against his aura, the containment lattice responding to each distant buffer activation, with subtle contractions that ripple through the arena floor. His attempt to stabilize is met with increasing difficulty as Baby aligns itself with the host's efforts, learning to ride the fluctuations introduced by global suppression. The negotiation within his Kai pathways becomes more intricate with every off-world stabilization array brought online, because resistance now requires him to counter environmental feedback generated thousands of kilometers away. The first confirmed off-site incident occurs when a coastal city's buffer network discharges during routine calibration, releasing a wave of static energy that passes through its shielding grid without physical breach. Civilians report momentary disorientation, and biometric scans reveal faint alterations in baseline Kai output among those exposed. No possession, but a resonance identical to that detected within the quarantine districts. Planetary authorities relay the findings to the Grand Priest, who tightens the advisory parameters. Yet the tightening increases stress across the containment lattice and accelerates the feedback loop connecting arena to global grid. Wise notes that each systemic response enacted to protect civilian populations now contributes to the adaptive model Baby is constructing within Jiren circulation, because suppression fields across the planet generate harmonics that align with the parasite's rhythm. The infection remains localized in flesh, but its influence extends through networks designed to regulate Kai exposure on a planetary scale. Beerus shifts slightly at the report, the observation platform beneath him fracturing under the casual motion, and glances toward Wise with an expression that suggests interest rather than urgency. Across the globe, energy rationing deepens as buffer arrays struggle to compensate for anomalies that were never meant to propagate beyond a single host. Jiren remains within the arena, fighting a silent battle against a presence that now learns from defenses enacted continents away, while Baby continues to adapt through resonance alone. Global suppression was supposed to starve the anomaly of pathways, but what it actually created was a uniform resistance across planetary Kai buffer networks that now pressed back against the containment lattice in measurable waves. Inside the arena, those waves translated into subtle oscillations along the seal's inner surface, compressing the atmosphere around Jiren, until the space he occupied felt less like air and more like fluid. He responded the only way his discipline allowed, drawing his aura inward until it formed a dense, static shell that barely disturbed the floor beneath his feet. For a brief interval, the monitors registered a decline in harmonic bleed-through, and the foreign waveform threading his Kai signature dipped beneath detectable thresholds. Baby did not challenge this compression directly, because dominance at this stage would invite immediate erasure. Instead, it aligned with the host's resistance, synchronizing its presence to Jiren's suppressed output so precisely that the shared signature appeared singular once more. Wise recognized the tactic at once, noting that concealment through cooperation represented a shift from passive adaptation to strategic negotiation. Jiren remained in control of his posture, his breathing, and his speech, yet every adjustment he made to maintain that control provided Baby with a deeper map of the pathways through which God-level Kai circulated. Resistance was still present, but it now served as instruction. The Grand Priest authorized a temporary relaxation of localized dampening fields within the quarantine districts, hoping to reduce internal pressure by allowing ambient energy to dissipate more naturally. That decision altered the equilibrium within the arena almost immediately, easing the strain on Jiren's compressed aura and granting him a momentary advantage in the internal struggle. He expanded his Kai by a fraction, testing whether the parasite would react with overt resistance, and for several seconds the monitors showed no change beyond a slight smoothing of his baseline signature. Then the harmonic returned, not as a spike, but as a layered echo riding the expanded output, perfectly synchronized with his breathing. Outside the arena, military containment teams reported marginal improvements in civilian stabilizer performance as the relaxed dampening reduced sympathetic resonance across infrastructure grids. Yet those improvements carried a cost, because the reintroduced ambient Kai created new interaction points through which Baby could sample environmental rhythms. Every restored transit conduit, every reactivated buffer array, produced faint echoes that aligned with the parasite's learned cadence, and those echoes fed back through the containment lattice into Jiren's circulation. Beerus watched the internal negotiation unfold with a detached interest that bordered on boredom, his tail flicking once as the arena floor trembled under a casual shift in his stance. Other gods of destruction interpreted the relaxation of suppression as a dangerous concession, arguing that dominance by the host could not be assumed when the parasite had already demonstrated strategic patience. Champa's irritation sharpened into open warning, while Belmod's silence suggested a recalculation of acceptable loss should resistance fail entirely. Jiren attempted a purge, releasing a controlled surge intended to flush the intruder into visibility without breaching the containment seal. The surge passed through his compressed shell and met Baby's synchronized presence with no immediate disruption, the harmonic merely adjusting to ride the rising wave. The monitors registered the interaction as a temporary stabilization, but Wise noted the deeper shift. The parasite had learned to maintain alignment even under increased output, preserving concealment while expanding its influence along the host's circulation pathways. The Grand Priest tightened observation protocols in response, directing all monitoring systems to prioritize layered signature analysis rather than baseline variance. That adjustment revealed subtle distortions in the way Jiren's aura interacted with the seal, distortions that mirrored the parasite's adaptive rhythm despite the host's apparent control. Resistance remained intact, yet dominance was no longer absolute, and every systemic change enacted to support Jiren's efforts provided Baby with additional data. Across the quarantine districts, civilian reports of ambient pressure eased slightly as suppression relaxed, but infrastructure monitors detected new harmonic echoes within transit grids previously cleared of resonance. Those echoes carried the same layered cadence observed within Jiren's aura, confirming that the parasite's influence now extended through environmental Kai interactions, even in the absence of direct contact. Jiren stood at the center of the arena, composed and silent, maintaining control over a body that now negotiated with an intelligence capable of learning from every act of resistance. Baby remained concealed within that control, adapting through synchronization rather than force, and the balance between dominance and resistance shifted with each recalibration of the containment lattice. The temporary relaxation of dampening fields was meant to give Jiren space to maintain control, but what it actually produced inside the containment lattice was a subtle equilibrium shift that neither the monitoring systems nor the assembled gods had anticipated. Ambient Chi, once suppressed across the quarantine districts, began circulating again through the city's buffer networks, and that circulation fed back into the arena as a low, steady pressure that no longer fluctuated in response to military regulation. For the first time since the initial contact, the force pressing against Jiren's compressed aura was consistent rather than oscillating, and that consistency created a dangerous illusion of stability. Jiren responded by expanding his Chi output another fraction, testing whether the reduced strain would allow him to flush the parasite through controlled exertion without breaching the seal. His aura spread outward in a measured wave, and for several seconds the foreign harmonic threading his signature appeared to dampen beneath the weight of his discipline. Observers across the platforms noted the shift, some interpreting it as a sign that resistance had reached a sustainable plateau, but Wise's gaze remained fixed on the deeper layers of the energy model, where synchronization patterns told a different story. Baby had not weakened. It had aligned so completely with the host's output that the shared signature now moved as one. This was the breakpoint, not because Jiren had lost control, but because the parasite no longer needed to challenge him to maintain influence. Every adjustment he made to stabilize his circulation now carried Baby's presence outward in perfect harmony, allowing it to sample the environmental Chi reintroduced by relaxed suppression. The monitors registered no spike, no overt distortion, yet layered analysis revealed a gradual shift in how his aura interacted with the containment lattice. Instead of rebounding off the seal's inner surface, portions of the expanded output now pass through in microcurrents, too small to register as breach but sufficient to introduce resonance beyond the arena. Outside the sealed perimeter, civilian stabilizers responded to these microcurrents with faint sympathetic vibrations that spread through transit grids previously cleared of anomaly. Infrastructure teams reported renewed pressure fluctuations along energy conduits, and biometric scans in multiple districts detected temporary variance in baseline Chi output among exposed populations. No possession occurred, yet the resonance carried the same layered cadence observed within Jiren's aura, confirming that environmental influence had crossed a threshold from incidental to systemic. The Grand Priest ordered immediate reinstatement of full dampening across the quarantine zone, but the action arrived a fraction too late to prevent the new interaction points from forming. As suppression fields powered up, the harmonics generated by their activation aligned with the parasite's synchronized rhythm, feeding additional data back through the containment lattice into Jiren's circulation. Resistance remained intact. His posture did not falter, his breathing stayed measured, but dominance was no longer singular, because Baby now understood how to extend its presence through cooperative output rather than overt expansion. Beerus watched the monitors adjust with mild interest, his tail flicking once as the arena floor trembled beneath a casual shift in his stance. Other gods of destruction interpreted the renewed resonance as confirmation that the breakpoint had passed, their earlier debates over jurisdiction replaced by calculations of containment failure thresholds. Champa's impatience sharpened into open calls for immediate host erasure, while Belmod's silence suggested a recalibration of acceptable loss should resistance collapse entirely. Jiren attempted one final purge, releasing a controlled surge designed to disrupt synchronization without exceeding the seal's tolerance. The surge passed through his aura and met Baby's aligned presence with no visible resistance, the harmonic merely adjusting to ride the increased output. Monitoring systems registered the interaction as stabilization, yet layered analysis revealed a deeper shift in the way his energy field interacted with the lattice. Across the quarantine districts, reports of ambient pressure returned as suppression tightened, but infrastructure monitors now detected harmonic echoes within systems previously unaffected by the anomaly. Those echoes carried the same synchronized cadence observed within Jiren's aura, confirming that the parasite's influence had reached a resistance breakpoint. The reinstatement of full dampening should have forced the anomaly back into isolation. Yet the moment suppression fields across the quarantine districts reached peak output, the containment lattice surrounding the arena began registering pressure that did not originate from within its own perimeter. Ambient Chi, redirected through planetary buffer networks, now pressed inward from multiple vectors at once, compressing the sealed space until the air around Jiren carried the density of something far closer to divine atmosphere than mortal environment. Monitoring systems struggled to reconcile the data because the harmonics feeding into the lattice were no longer limited to local infrastructure, but aligned with off-site suppression arrays brought online during global escalation. Wise observed the shift without intervening, nodding that the parasite's synchronized presence within Jiren's circulation had begun responding to these external pressures with a subtle expansion that did not breach the seal yet altered its interaction with the inner boundary. His aura remained compressed by discipline, posture unchanged, breathing measured, but the layered cadence threading his Chi signature now carried a second intention, one that adjusted to containment protocols in real time. Baby had learned to treat the lattice itself as an environmental constant, aligning with its oscillations to preserve concealment while sampling the redirected energy pressing inward. The Grand Priest responded by reinforcing the arena's inner barrier with a secondary divine seal, an action reserved for incidents involving cross-universal contamination risk. The activation of that seal introduced God-level Chi into the containment system, stabilizing structural integrity while raising internal pressure to a threshold few mortals could survive. Jiren did not falter under the added strain, yet the negotiation within his circulation intensified as Baby adapted to the presence of divine energy, not introduced through direct contact, but through environmental reinforcement. Around the observation platforms, the assembled gods of destruction shifted from procedural debate to direct engagement, because the reinforced seal represented acknowledgement that mortal containment measures had failed. Champa stepped forward, Chi presence alone warping the space around his position, while Belmont's aura flared in response to the new divine input within the lattice. Their movements did not breach the quarantine, but the pressure they introduced fed into the sealed environment as measurable waves, each carrying a God-level signature that the parasite immediately began mapping. Beerus opened his eyes fully for the first time since the initial contact, irritation giving way to interest as the arena floor fractured beneath his casual shift in stance. He did not move to intervene, because the hierarchy remained intact so long as containment held, yet his presence alone altered the equilibrium within the lattice. Divine Chi from multiple sources now circulated through the reinforced seal, creating interaction points that no mortal system had been designed to regulate. Jiren attempted to stabilize under the added strain by compressing his aura once more, drawing it inward until the air around him ceased vibrating with visible distortion. For several seconds the monitors registered a decline in harmonic bleed-through, and hope flickered among those tasked with analysis. Baby responded by aligning with the compressed output, synchronizing its presence to preserve concealment while sampling the God-level energy introduced through reinforcement. Outside the arena, infrastructure teams reported renewed sympathetic vibrations across buffer networks previously cleared of anomaly, their systems responding to the divine harmonics circulating through the lattice. Biometric scans in distant population centers detected faint alterations in baseline Chi output among exposed civilians, confirming that the conflict had escalated beyond planetary containment into a cross-tier interaction between mortal systems and God-level energy. The Grand Priest tightened observation protocols once more, directing all monitoring systems to prioritize layered signature analysis capable of detecting synchronization rather than variance. That adjustment revealed subtle distortions in the way Jiren's aura interacted with the reinforced seal, distortions that mirrored the parasite's adaptive rhythm despite the host's continued resistance. Beerus watched the reading stabilize into a new equilibrium, tail flicking once as a distant buffer array discharged under the strain of global suppression. Jiren remained composed at the center of the arena, maintaining control over a body negotiating with an intelligence now capable of learning from divine reinforcement itself. The moment the Grand Priest's secondary divine seal reaches full synchronization with the original containment lattice, the arena ceases to behave like a quarantined environment and instead becomes something closer to a pressure vessel filled with circulating god-level Chi. Mortal stabilizers across the quarantine districts struggle to maintain equilibrium as divine reinforcement feeds back through planetary buffer networks, creating sympathetic vibrations that infrastructure was never designed to absorb. Reports from distant population centers confirm minor but consistent alterations in baseline Chi output among civilians exposed to these harmonics, and those alterations no longer dissipate when suppression fields cycle down. Inside the arena, Jiren maintains his stance with the same stoic discipline that defined him before infection, yet the layered cadence threading his aura now responds not only to environmental pressure, but to divine input circulating through the reinforced seal. Baby aligns with each recalibration he makes, preserving concealment while mapping how god-level Chi interacts with mortal circulation pathways. Resistance remains present, his breathing measured, posture unchanged, but dominance is no longer singular because the parasite now learns from the very energy meant to contain it. Wise observes the interaction without immediate intervention, nodding that the negotiation within Jiren's circulation has reached a threshold where synchronization persists even under increased suppression. The Grand Priest responds by tightening the secondary seal, reducing permissible energy output within the arena to prevent further harmonic bleed-through into planetary networks. That action stabilizes civilian infrastructure temporarily, yet it raises internal pressure to a level that forces Jiren to compress his aura beyond sustainable tolerance. He attempts to comply, drawing his Chi inward until the air around him ceases vibrating entirely, and for several seconds the monitors register a decline in foreign harmonic activity. Then the layered cadence returns, not as an independent waveform but embedded within his baseline signature, perfectly synchronized with the compressed output. Baby has not overtaken control, but it no longer needs to challenge resistance to maintain influence. Across the observation platforms, the assembled gods of destruction recognize the shift at once, because the host's signature can no longer be separated cleanly from the parasite's presence. Champa's earlier calls for erasure sharpen into open demand, while Belmod's silence reflects a recalculation of acceptable loss should containment fail entirely. Beerus watches the readings with detached interest, the arena floor fracturing beneath a casual adjustment in his stance. Outside the sealed perimeter, infrastructure teams report the first persistent resonance within transit grids previously cleared of anomaly, confirming that environmental influence has reached a threshold where suppression alone cannot reverse it. The Grand Priest acknowledges the development as an irreversible loss, not of the host, who remains in control, but of the containment model that assumed influence would remain localized to direct contact. Jiren stands at the center of the arena, composed and silent, maintaining control over a body that now carries a synchronized presence capable of learning from divine reinforcement itself. Baby remains concealed within that control, adapting through alignment rather than force, and the containment lattice hums with a note that no longer fades when suppression cycles down. The declaration of irreversible loss does not arrive with spectacle or collapse, but with a procedural silence that settles across the observation platforms as the Grand Priest's containment lattice adjusts to a reality it was never meant to accommodate. Planetary buffer networks continue cycling through suppression patterns, yet the persistent resonance detected within civilian transit grids no longer responds to those cycles, holding steady as a background harmonic aligned with the synchronized cadence now embedded in Jiren's aura. Mortal infrastructure has become an unwitting extension of the sealed arena, carrying echoes of divine reinforcement across distances that no longer matter to an intelligence capable of learning through Kai interaction alone. Inside the reinforced perimeter, Jiren maintains control over his posture and breath, yet the negotiation within his circulation has shifted from resistance against intrusion to regulation of coexistence. Baby remains concealed, aligned with each adjustment he makes to stabilize under pressure, preserving the host's discipline while expanding its understanding of how divine Kai behaves when redirected through containment systems. Wise observes this equilibrium without intervening, recognizing that overt action at this stage would disrupt a balance already carrying planetary consequences. The assembled gods of destruction move from observation to engagement as the reinforced seal begins registering pressure that originates from their own proximity. Champa steps forward first, aura flaring in response to the persistent resonance circulating through the lattice, while Belmod follows with measured restraint that nevertheless introduces additional divine harmonics into the sealed environment. Their presence does not breach containment, but the god-level Kai they emit feeds directly into the pressure vessel the arena has become, and Baby immediately begins mapping these new inputs through Jiren's synchronized output. Beerus rises at last, not out of anger but because the balance has shifted enough to warrant attention, and his casual movement fractures the platform beneath him in shallow cracks that ripple outward toward the seal. He does not approach the host. He merely allows his presence to enter the reinforced perimeter as environmental pressure, an act that introduces Haki-aligned Kai into the containment system without direct contact. The effect is immediate, stabilizing structural integrity while raising internal density to a threshold few mortals could survive. Jiren compresses his aura further in response, drawing it inward until the air around him ceases vibrating entirely, and for several seconds the monitors register a decline in harmonic bleed-through. Baby aligns with the compressed output, preserving concealment while sampling the hack-infused energy circulating through the lattice. Resistance remains intact, yet dominance is no longer singular, because the parasite now learns from destruction itself. Outside the arena, infrastructure teams report renewed sympathetic vibrations across planetary buffer networks, their systems responding to divine harmonics introduced by the assembled gods' proximity. Biometric scans confirm persistent alterations in baseline Kai output among exposed populations, confirming that the conflict has reached a stage where mortal containment cannot reverse environmental influence. The Grand Priest tightens observation protocols once more, directing all monitoring systems to prioritize layered signature analysis capable of detecting synchronization rather than variance. That adjustment reveals subtle distortions in the way Jiren's aura interacts with the hack-aligned reinforcement, distortions that mirror the parasite's adaptive rhythm despite the host's continued control. Beerus watches the readings stabilize into a new equilibrium, tail flicking once as distant buffer arrays cycle under global suppression. Jiren remains composed at the center of the arena, maintaining control over a body negotiating with an intelligence now capable of learning from god-level destruction itself. By the time the reinforced lattice stabilizes under the combined presence of multiple gods of destruction, the arena has ceased to be a place of competition and instead functions as a controlled intersection between mortal circulation and divine reinforcement. Planetary buffer networks continue transmitting persistent resonance aligned with the synchronized cadence now embedded within Jiren's aura, and suppression cycles across quarantine districts no longer produce measurable reductions in environmental influence. Mortal infrastructure has adapted to carry the harmonic as background noise, integrating what began as an anomaly into baseline operation without conscious awareness. Inside the sealed perimeter, Jiren stands as he has throughout the escalation, posture unchanged, breathing measured, discipline intact. Yet the negotiation within his circulation has reached a stable coexistence rather than a contested resistance. Baby remains concealed within that equilibrium, aligned with each recalibration he makes to regulate the hack-infused pressure circulating through the lattice. Wise observes without intervening, recognizing that the host has not lost control, but neither does he retain singular ownership of the pathways through which his Kai now moves. The Grand Priest acknowledges the equilibrium with a procedural gesture that lowers secondary observation thresholds, not because the threat has diminished, but because its nature has changed beyond containment through suppression alone. Environmental influence persists across planetary networks, confirmed by biometric scans that no longer revert to pre-incident baselines even after full dampening cycles. The containment model that assumed isolation through contact has failed, replaced by a systemic coexistence that no longer requires proximity to sustain resonance. Beerus regards the stabilized readings with mild irritation rather than triumph, his tail flicking once as the arena floor settles beneath his stance. He does not approach Jiren, does not offer explanation, and does not attempt to reverse the introduction he initiated, because the balance has resolved into a state that does not inconvenience him directly. His hack-aligned presence remains within the reinforced seal as environmental pressure, a reminder that absolute destruction is available should coexistence collapse into dominance. Across the observation platforms, the assembled gods of destruction recognize the permanence of the outcome, their earlier debates over erasure replaced by calculations of long-term precedent. Champa's impatience fades into reluctant acceptance, while Belmont's silence reflects the understanding that the host now carries an intelligence capable of learning from divine input without overt possession. Outside the arena, civilian infrastructure continues operating under suppression protocols that no longer eliminate the persistent harmonic circulating through transit grids and buffer arrays. The resonance has become part of the planetary Kai environment, detectable but stable, influencing baseline output without manifesting direct control. Mortal populations resume movement within the quarantine districts, unaware that their systems now carry echoes of a negotiation fought within a single host. Jiren remains at the center of the sealed arena, composed and silent, maintaining discipline over a body that has permanently integrated synchronized presence. Baby persists within that integration, adapting through alignment rather than force, and the containment lattice hums with a note that no longer fades with suppression. The world does not return to normal. It adjusts to a balance that includes what should never have existed within mortal circulation. Beerus turns away from the stabilized monitors, curiosity satisfied, as the reinforced seal holds around an equilibrium that cannot be undone without erasing the host himself.